Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Maartje.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it.
Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are talking about Memphis Belle, which came out in 1990. It was directed by Michael Caden Jones and written by Monty Merrick. It's a fictionalized version of the 1944 documentary Memphis Belle, A Story of a Flying Fortress, by director William Wyler, about the final combat mission of an American B-17 bomber crew. And you can watch this documentary on YouTube. That's good. And the 1990 version was co-produced by William Wyler's daughter, Catherine. So, what did you think of this movie?
I liked it. It's a classic American war film. You sort of know what to expect going into it, but I enjoyed it. I thought the fight scene was really good. So when they go up and fly a mission, that's pretty much like an hour's worth of the movie. And a lot of the shots feel familiar from the documentary. And yeah, I enjoyed it. It's a bit silly and sort of over dramatic in parts, but I had a good watching experience. How about you?
I have a strange relationship with this movie. I've not seen the documentary, so that's a shame. I was going to, but I just ran out of time, so I will watch it after this. I watched this movie twice. I watched this movie in the spring of this year first, and I didn't really like it. And then I watched it again in preparation of this podcast, and I really enjoyed it. I don't know, I think I didn't like it the first time because I didn't really understand, Bomber Command, and I guess how flight crews worked. And since then I've watched Masters of the Air 20 times and read some books, and now I kind of get what they're talking about, and I enjoyed it a lot more. I thought, the acting's alright, it's not great, but also not bad. And I did quite like all the exterior shots of the B-17s. They are very cool, very, very, very cool. So those make me enjoy the movie a bit more, I guess. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Nice.
So let's get into the plot. We start the movie with a dark screen, and we can hear the wind kind of whistling in the background. And we soar slowly into a blue sky, and this is a quote that appears on the screen. In the summer of 1943, a fierce battle raged in the skies over Europe. Every day, hundreds of young airmen faced death as they flew bombing raids deep into enemy territory. Fewer and fewer were coming back.
For those of us who are familiar with Masters of the Air, especially in the book, they go into this a lot. The casualty rate for bomber crews was pretty brutal. I think it was like a 1 in 5 chance of getting your 25 missions done. And so when they first started flying combat missions, there actually wasn't a limit. It was just, you're going to fly missions until your tour is done. And then they realized that the casualty rates were so high and it was so damaging to morale that they had to put a cap on limits so that the guys had something to look forward to. So they had this 25 mission cap. It later got raised to 30 and then 35 even maybe. And yeah, it was just your odds of making it all the way to the end of your missions were really low.
Yeah, imagine getting into those planes every single time. It must be so mentally stressful to do that.
Absolutely. The crew members of the B-17 bomber Memphis Belle are introduced to us in voiceover while they're playing football. So we have our officers, their Captain Dennis Dearborn, who's the pilot, played by Matthew Modine. First Lieutenant Luke Sinclair, he's the co-pilot, played by Tate Donovan. First Lieutenant Phil Lowenthal, the navigator, played by D.B. Sweeney. And First Lieutenant Val Kozlowski, the bombardier, played by Billy Zane of Titanic fame.
Yay!
Listen, I was so excited that Billy Zane was in this. I was like, Billy Zane!
He's very good. He's very enjoyable. He's got a nice face.
He's got a fun mustache in this, too. We love to see it. We also have our enlisted men, Staff Sergeant Danny Daly, the radio operator, played by Eric Stoltz. Staff Sergeant Virgil Hochsteger, the top turret gunner and flight engineer, played by Reed Diamond. Staff Sergeant Richard Rascal Moore, the ball turret gunner, played by Sean Astin. And Staff Sergeant Eugene McVeigh, the right waist gunner, played by Courtney Gaines. Sergeant Jack Bocci, left waist gunner, played by Neil Giuntoli. And Staff Sergeant Clay Busby, tail gunner, played by Harry Connick Jr. And if you're thinking, wow, do all these white guys look the same? They kind of do. But like every war movie that we watch.
I do feel like they do a good enough job of introducing them that you can kind of tell them apart, except for maybe the people that don't have a lot of lines.
Yeah, it's almost, I feel like in movies like this, the characters almost have to be a little bit caricaturist because you have so little time to get to know everyone and differentiate them in your mind. It is established that the crew are about to embark on their 25th and final combat mission. Today is May 16th, 1943. As the men watch another group of bombers return from their mission, a plane tries to make a landing on one wheel and explodes before the crew can get to safety. And they're all watching this plane burn on the runway, and it's definitely a bad omen.
Yes, it's like a bit of foreshadowing, for sure.
Yeah.
I thought this was an interesting way of opening the movie, seeing that crash, because it goes from being kind of happy-go-lucky to serious really, really, really quick. Like, they're playing football and they're being goofy and young boys, and then they see their fellow crew members get killed instantly.
Yeah, and the especially brutal thing is that crew survived their mission and then got back and were supposed to be safe, but they had a technical malfunction that got all of them killed. So that's got to be pretty sobering.
Yeah, if it's not the Germans that'll kill you, it'll be your own plane, which is true for a lot of these Bomber Command stuff. I keep saying Bomber Command, but I feel that's the RAF, so it's confusing. It's fine. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Derringer, played by John Lithgow, is taking the opportunity to make PR Hay out of the Memphis Belle being the first aircrew in the Air Force to successfully complete 25 missions. He's interviewing and photographing them, and we learn more about their lives. The men will be going on a warband drive when they get home. I like this bit because you can tell a lot about their personalities from these little interview clips. Like, some of them are really just don't want to do it. Others are really interested, like the co-pilot. He's really, loves the attention. And the other guys don't really want to do it. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's fun that it's kind of meta, too. Obviously, this is a fictionalized version of the documentary that came out in 1944. So we're almost getting to see the quote-unquote making of that documentary in the fictional movie.
Yes. I like the difference between the pilot and the co-pilot in this quite a lot. You have, I've already forgotten the name again, the pilot.
The pilot's name is Dennis Dearborn.
Yeah, Dearborn, who's got a quiet, almost a bit boring, and then you've got the co-pilot who's super brash, and Sinclair, his name is, and he's kind of annoying. I would find him really annoying. But he's like the dashing pilot, the way you see dashing pilots in old films. I thought it was funny. Definitely a caricature, though, I feel, the co-pilot, for sure.
Yeah. Worth mentioning that these are not the names of the real crew of the Memphis Belle. This is not based on the real people. They pretty much borrowed the name of the plane and sort of the premise of the documentary, that it was their final mission, but everything else is pretty much made up for the movie.
You said something funny to me when we were talking about it to George, actually, for fun. You said they sure did manage to put every single story about the Air Force in this movie.
They really did. And we'll talk about it as we go through, but it's funny. When they go up on their mission, everything that could go wrong does go wrong. And that didn't happen in real life, obviously, in the final mission of the Memphis Belle. They literally took, I mean, if you read Masters of the Air, it's there's little things where it's oh, this happened to this plane and this happened to that crew. And they've just lifted all these little anecdotal stories and put them all into this movie. So it's pretty action-packed. That night, there is a big dance held for the airmen, and we follow the members of the crew as they make merry or prepare for their final flight, depending on the crew member in question. Virgil Hochstetter, who's jokingly called Virgin by fellow turret gunner Rascal, wins over a local woman named Faith, played by Jane Horrocks, and gets busy with her inside their fort. So, I mean, I don't know if this would have been possible in real life or if this was happening a lot, but I do feel like if you put a bunch of young dudes somewhere, they will figure out somewhere to fuck. So maybe it did. The captain, Dennis Dearborn, goes out on his own to say a little fond farewell to the fort that has gotten them through so many missions, safe and sound, named Memphis Belle after his girl back home. And that part is based on real life. The real Memphis Belle was named after the girlfriend of the pilot. And Danny, called Danny Boy by the other men, goes around taking photos of everyone. He comforts a nervous new airman who's about to embark on his first mission. And Phil, the navigator, becomes convinced that he's going to die. And he gets so drunk that Bombardier Val has to come and rouse him off the hard stands when it's time to get up for breakfast.
I mean, I can imagine after you've just seen a plane get exploded on the runway on their way back. It's like, good luck.
Yeah, for sure.
The men attend a briefing, hoping for a milk run to France for their last mission. A milk run is just an easy mission. Instead, they will be bombing a fighter plane manufacturing plant in Bremen, Germany. The men get antsy waiting to fly as inclement weather over the target delays the mission. Co-pilot Luke begs Tail Gunner Clay to request assistance when they're in the air, so that Luke can finally get a chance to fire a gun in combat, because he's never done it.
Yeah, Luke has a big old chip on his shoulder about being a co-pilot, because obviously you get the same training as a pilot, but you never get your own plane, you never get your own crew. So he wants the chance to make a bit of a name for himself, I guess.
He wants the glory.
He does.
He's a little glory boy, for sure.
Yeah, he's real excited about getting famous from this war bond drive. That's his cup of tea for sure.
Yeah.
The first part of the flight is calm. They take off and get up into the air, and the men discuss what they're going to do after the war. There's a really sort of sad / funny moment where the pilot, who's kind of like, for all that he's, the pilot and the leader of the crew, he's a bit of a wallflower. He's kind of socially awkward. And he tells the crew that after the war, if they want, they can all come work for him at his parents' furniture business. And then there's just a long silence while no one takes him up on it.
Yeah, it's like he's like the least liked person on the plane almost. He's quite likable, but he's really quiet, and he's not like any of the pilots you read about in stories. He's just keeps to himself, tries to keep his head down, has got no bravado whatsoever.
He's got no riz, we'll say that. No. He's profoundly rizless, as the kids say.
Yeah.
The bomber crew formation is escorted part of the way by P-51 Mustang fighter planes, which ably see off several enemy fighters. However, as was often the case on these, the Mustangs run out of fuel long before the bombers reach the target and have to turn back. And so the bombers have to rely on flying in formation and their own guns to protect themselves when they get over Germany.
And in this movie too, like in many of the other movies, the bomber crew kind of envy the fighters. They just all want to be in fighter planes.
Yeah. I mean, the fighter pilots definitely had their own risk-taking that they were doing. It also wasn't particularly safe to be flying daylight missions in a fighter plane.
It's just Luke's dream job, I think, to have a plane of his own and be this flashy fighter pilot.
Absolutely.
The Belle must take over as lead plane as flak and enemy fighters begin to take their toll on the bomber formation. The two waist gunners get into a fight, a very strange fight, and Jack pretends to throw Eugene's good luck pendant out of the window. When Jack is wounded, but it proves to be a minor wound, he reveals that he only pretended to throw away the charm, and the two make up. These were children. Yeah,
I did like that fight because it really hits home that, these guys are not that old,
No.
What a stupid thing to fight about.
It's like a proper kid's fight, like taking something that belongs to the other person and then really pettily throwing it out of the window.
Yeah. I did see a few reviews online where people were saying, and we did talk about this a bit offline, but people were saying that they had a hard time, differentiating among the crew and sort of getting anything to latch onto in the characters. But I sort of disagree with that. And I almost wonder if it's because we watched so much World War II media and I'm just having to get to know all these different white guys. So I really pay attention to who's who. But I did feel like they did like a decent job of sort of showing us who they were through their relationships with the other guys on the plane, who their friends were, who they liked and didn't like, that kind of stuff.
I think I did feel that way the first time I watched it. I did feel like I didn't really know these guys, so why should I root for them? But then the second time I watched it, I didn't feel like that. So I don't know if that's because I already kind of knew them at this point because I'd seen it before. Or like you said, I just look for different things now that I've seen so many war movies. I don't know. Weird.
Also, they don't really make a huge deal of taking over as lead plane, but being lead plane was actually a pretty difficult job. A crew that flew lead plane would do it pretty routinely so that they got good at it. But obviously, if you're in the lead, it's going to be your bombardier who, spots the target and drops the bombs first, and everyone's going to follow your lead. It's going to be your navigator who figures out what route you're going to take and all that kind of stuff. So flying lead plane was actually pretty difficult. And yeah, they don't make a huge deal out of it in this movie. They're just like, oh, we're just going to, the two other planes are gone. We're just going to take over now.
They do mention, though, at some point when they have to make the approach to the bomb run, they do say, we got to get this right because there's other people kind of depending on us. They do say it, but only once. It's not super clear or hammered upon that this is a tough job to do. You're right. And can I just say, if you want to learn more about how a bomb run actually works and what goes into it, you should really read On a Wing and a Prayer, because Harry Crosby explains it to you in detail, and it sounds very complicated.
Yeah, he does explain it in detail, but he has a really strong narrative voice and he's funny, so it's a fun read.
Yeah, it's very nice. I do have trouble understanding what it's. You have the rendezvous point, and then you have loads of different points in a mission that you don't see in any movie. But they have to hit certain targets in time as well. It's not just a dropping of the bomb, but if they get to a certain place on the bomb run too late, they'll miss their other wings, the different parts of their formation. It's really tricky to do.
Absolutely. And just for some of our listeners who I know listen to this podcast and aren't super big on or not super knowledgeable about World War II, during the war, there was a lot of discussion over how effective strategic bombing was. The Brits would only fly bombing missions at night because they were less concerned about what targets they were hitting. The Americans flew daytime missions, which was super dangerous. Far, far more American planes were shot down than British planes. And the Americans had this piece of technology called the Norden bomb sight, and the Germans didn't have it. So if you knew your plane was going down, you had to destroy it so it wouldn't fall into enemy hands. And yeah, so because they had this bomb sight, they could theoretically hit a target much more easily from the air. And, people still dispute how effective that was, whether they were actually precisely hitting targets or not. But yeah.
That's why also in Masters of the Air, they have this discussion about hitting a certain target when there's a church and a factory houses pretty close to those targets. And they say, well, the bomb sight can hit those targets, but it's still, if you miss, you'll just hit a church. And it has happened. Churches have been hit in this conflict, so it's really tricky.
Mm-hmm. Throughout the flight, Danny, the radio operator, occasionally gets communication from the new air crew, whose radioman he met the night before. So he had met this guy in the bathroom who was brand new, and they kind of had a bit of a chat. And the guy is from a brand new crew. This is their first mission. And he doesn't really understand that you're supposed to stay off the radio because the Germans will listen in. They can hear. So he's calling over and he's like, oh, am I supposed to do this? Am I supposed to do that? He's really nervous. And the new crew ultimately gets shot down. And Danny is frantically trying to reestablish contact. And then only 2 shoots emerge from the falling plane.
I could do without this radio because it broke my heart. You can hear them screaming and stuff. It's just horrible. Did we really need to hear them die in this radio conversation? It's horrible.
Yeah. And it's just so bleak. They're looking out the window, counting parachutes. Oh, how many did you see? Oh, I only saw 2. And yeah, pretty grim.
There is cloud cover over the target, and pilot Dennis makes the unpopular decision to circle around and fly over the target again. This time they are able to drop their payload. What this means is that they'll have to go through the flak and the German fighters twice. So that's the reason why it's unpopular. They just have to go again and risk their lives with them.
Yeah, I do feel in real life they normally would have had a backup target.
A secondary target, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know why they wouldn't just go and try and hit that one, but a drama, I guess.
Probably because this is a better story for sure. And he actually fights but Luke really doesn't want to do it. And neither does Val, the bombardier. And he's like, I can't see. And it's like, there's Cloak Lover. And it's an interesting piece of dialogue between the three, really.
Yeah, well, and the navigator is trying to almost fight the bombardier as well to make him drop the bomb so that they can turn around and go home.
Yeah.
On the way home, radio man Danny is badly wounded. Bombardier Val had previously claimed to have 4 years of medical school. This came up when they were doing the interviews to get them ready for the war bond drive. But it turns out he only went for 2 weeks and then he dropped out. So initially, he's too afraid to try and treat Danny. He suggests dropping him from the plane with a chute so he can be picked up by the Germans and taken to a hospital. And this is one of those stories that comes from real life. If an airman was really badly wounded, for example, I remember a story about one who'd had like his arm was cut off by flak, I think it was. And they were like, listen, by the time we get home, it's like a 2-hour flight from here. He's going to bleed to death. He has better odds if we drop him out of the plane because if the Germans pick him up, they'll bring him to a hospital. However, the men are able to convince him to try and treat Danny, who dies for a second. And Val does that classic movie CPR where he's like, wake up, come back to me. And he's like, he'll do like 4 compressions and then he like leans down and listens to his chest. And then he does like 4 more compressions and he leans down and listens to his chest. And you're like, I don't know what this is accomplishing, but Danny magically comes back from the dead.
Movie magic, this is. The incident you just mentioned of the airman with his arm cut off, we talked about this when we did 12 O'Clock High as well.
Oh, there we go.
That's where the story comes from. It's at the very start of the movie, they take out an arm and a body, I think. Or just the arm, maybe, I don't remember. It's one of those. Also, Danny is a poet. And he's read, when they were waiting for the mission to start, he's read to them a poem that he supposedly wrote. But it turns out that he's not written this poem at all. He's just pretended that it was his. I can't remember who wrote it.
It's a pretty famous poem by a pretty famous poet. I can't remember the name of the poem, but it's by W.B. Yeats. And it's
right,
like,
Yeats.
Any of these guys, like, come on, nobody recognized that was a Yeats poem?
Listen, son, they are young, silly boys. How are they supposed to know poetry?
The thing is that, I mean, 4 of them are officers, so they've probably been to college. I don't know.
One of the engines is badly damaged and on fire, so the 2 pilots must put the fire out by putting the plane into and successfully pulling out of a very dangerous dive. They are 2 engines down by now and must throw everything heavy out of the plane as they approach the English coast. We see this in the Masters of the Air as well. Both these things happen in Masters of the Air too.
Yeah, just imagine your engine being on fire and being like, well, we're going to basically go into a death dive and try and put this fire out. Hopefully I pull up before we hit the English Channel.
Yeah, and this is also the moment where Luke and Dennis kind of bond over being pilots, and Luke finally starts to respect Dennis.
Yeah, the electrical systems prevent the landing gear from successfully coming down. Another tale that will be familiar if you watched or read Masters of the Air. And the crew must manually crank the second landing wheel down just in time to hit the runway.
Yep. This was stressful, to be honest. I was almost dying during this scene. I was like, oh geez, are they gonna make it?
I know. Definitely heard John Brady from Masters of the Air in my head saying, we have a better chance of walking away from a belly landing than we do on one wheel.
Yep. The men get out of the plane, so they do survive, kissing the runway and celebrating their safe return with champagne. The end card state, the Memphis Belle flew her 25th and final mission on May 17, 1943. Over 250,000 aircraft battled for supremacy in the skies over Western Europe, and nearly 200,000 aircrew lost their lives. Jesus, that's a lot. This film is dedicated to all the brave young men, whatever their nationality, who flew and fought in history's greatest airborne confrontation.
One of the things I liked about this movie was I had just watched the documentary, and some of the shots from this movie, particularly during the air fight, are very similar to the documentary. And there's actually, when the guys get out of their plane in the documentary, one of them gets down and kisses the ground, and it's almost exactly the same shot there is in this movie. So I thought that was cool.
Sweet. Also, most of the aerial shots, I think there's obviously some not real ones, but there's quite a few real ones in there as well, which just looks really cool.
Yeah, if you get a chance to go on YouTube and watch the Memphis Belle documentary, it's not very long. I think it's only 40 minutes, and there's just some really cool footage. It's definitely worth a watch if you're interested in this kind of stuff.
I'll put it on the website. We can just watch it on our website. How cool is that?
Nice.
So, me not having seen the documentary, can you tell me a little bit about it?
The Memphis Belle, A Story of a Flying Fortress, follows the real-life crew of the Memphis Belle on their final mission, led by Captain Robert Morgan. We see footage covering everything from the ground crew, hard at work on the plane, through the pre-mission briefing, through the mission itself. It was made by the 1st Motion Picture Unit, which was part of the United States Army Air Forces. Yes, they did have a movie unit. And it actually depicts the next to last mission of the Memphis Belle, which was on May 15th, 1943. Obviously, when you're making a movie, you want to make sure that you have all the necessary footage and that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Weiler didn't want to stage it. He took flight training courses. We touched on this briefly. What Weiler? Did he make 12 O'Clock High? No, he made
The Best Years of Our Lives.
Yeah, so we touched on this briefly, but he took flight training courses so he could fly with real bomber crews. And they were up there in the action. One of his cinematographers, First Lieutenant Harold J. Tannenbaum, was actually killed in action when his bomber was shot down. Weiler initially planned to work with another crew, the plane was called Invasion Second of the 401st Bomb Squadron, but they were actually shot down over Bremen on April 17th, 1943. Weiler flew more than 6 combat missions with the crew of the Memphis Belle, but they also had a backup crew ready in the event that the Memphis Belle was also shot down. In the documentary, during the briefing for the last Memphis Belle mission, written on the board, you can see that one of the planes in the mission is commanded by a pilot named Lay. And if everyone remembers, Baron Lay, he was one of the writers of 12 O'Clock High, and he was a pilot in the 8th Air Force, so it's probably him.
Really cool. And also, wasn't it Lay who was supposed to be on another plane but he wasn't, and then this plane that he was supposed to be on actually was shot down? Didn't we just read that somewhere? I don't remember.
Super possible. I don't remember, but my brain is swollen today. Weiler had to fight for the film's release because at the time it was considered to be too gruesome and realistic, but it ended up being a huge success. It was the first movie in history to be reviewed on the front page of the New York Times. And, oh yeah, I have it here in my notes. As we know, Weiler went on to make the classic film, The Best Years of Our Lives, after his Army career ended because he was deafened by repeated flights in a B-25, which I think we also touched on in our other episode.
Yeah.
Captain Morgan of the real Memphis Belle, which, by the way, LOL, Captain Morgan of rum fame, of the pilot of the real Memphis Belle, he actually went on to fly another 26 combat missions in the Pacific after he finished his combat missions in Europe. Couldn't get enough, I guess.
I was going to say, yeah.
He continued to make air show appearances until his death in 2004. So he remained in the Air Force for a little while after the war, too, I believe. And the real Memphis Belle, B-17, joined her crew on the War Bond Drive. They actually, they flew it from place to place. They took it around with them, which I didn't realize would be a thing. And it was later used for training at an airbase in Florida. And then the city of Memphis, I guess in a sort of PR attempt, bought the plane in 1945, and she actually sat outside for many years on display. And obviously, if you leave something like that outside without maintaining it, it starts to get damaged. So the Air Force reclaimed it for restoration, and she has been restored and on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson AFB in Dayton, Ohio since 2018.
Pretty cool. And on my last tour with We Happy Few, when we went on the 8th Air Force tour, we actually went to RAF Bassingbourn, which is where the Memphis Belle flew from. So I've seen that base.
That's so cool.
And the control tower is still there. It's in disarray, but it's still there, so you can look at it.
That's really neat. Yeah, I don't remember if they said this in the documentary or if it was in this movie, but I heard someone reference it as the whole country of the United Kingdom was basically one big aircraft carrier during World War II.
Yes.
Because there was so many just Air Force bases and airstrips just all over the entire country.
Yeah, it was really quite cool to see it's still a base, it's an active base today for training purposes. But it was quite cool to see an actual active base that would have had planes like the Memphis Belle and stuff. It's quite hard to imagine what it would have been like back in those days, but it's still like super sweet. And we saw like a couple of Spitfires and stuff flying around. I was like, oh, cool.
That's so cool. It's like you went back in time, you know?
Yes.
We gotta rate this movie. Let's rate it Billy Zane's 1940s mustache out of 10. How many Billy Zane's 1940s mustaches out of 10 would you rate this movie? I realized halfway through that I would have to pluralize mustache, and my brain just really tripped over it for some reason.
I would rate this movie, I don't know, 7.5 Billy Zane's mustaches out of 10, I guess. It would have been, if I'd rated it the first time, it would have been like a 5.5. So it went up 2 points in the meantime. I just enjoyed it. It's not like, I don't love it as much as some other people love this movie. I feel like this is for some people, this is like their favorite war movie. It's not for me, but I did enjoy it. So that's a 7.5, and I think I would watch it again. So, how about you?
Yeah, I'll also give it a 7.5 Billy Zane's 1940s mustaches out of 10. It was fun. You know, it was about what I expected. And I did have to laugh, kind of being familiar as we are with all of these real life stories of bomber crews, seeing them jam pack all of these stories that had happened to all these different crews into one crew's final mission to make it as intense and dramatic and Hollywood as possible. And, you know, it's the characters are a bit, you know, flat potentially, but it's fun. You know, you'll have a good time if you watch it. So yeah, I would say it's one of those movies that I could throw on and not think about too much, which is never a bad thing.
No. Do you have a favorite character out of all these?
Gosh, I sort of liked the one who was going around taking pictures of everyone.
Danny.
Yeah, I thought, yeah, I kind of liked that he was, you know, a bit more on the thoughtful side, and he was trying to document everything for posterity. And there was kind of this sense of, obviously they were excited to get their missions over with and get the hell out of there and go home, especially since they were the first crew in the 8th Air Force to do it. Not the first flight crew, period, but the first in the 8th Air Force. And, you know, it was a pretty difficult thing to do. Not a lot of crews were even able to do that. So they're excited to go home, but there also was this sense of like, we'll never be here again. Like, we'll never be together again. We'll never be, you know, and they were very accustomed to living in each other's pockets and having each other's backs. So there was kind of this sense of nostalgia and trying to capture the moment and not forget about this particular time and these people.
We didn't really talk about it during our going over the movie, but there's another thing I realized I quite liked. John Lithgow's character is obviously all about this PR opportunity, and I quite like that you've got like the commander, the 8th Air Force commander, I think he is, trying to defend his crews, and like John Lithgow's character keeps wanting to make like a coming home party, and he's like, no, that's bad luck, and I won't have it on my base. And there's all these other crews too to think about that still have to go out there and are just as important to me. And I quite like that they had a little bit in there. So maybe that's why I liked it better the second time as well, because I realize more now than I did when I watched it the first time the enormous risk that every single person getting into this plane is taking. Like, it's so tense. Like, you never know. It's really just a roll of the dice if you're gonna make it or not. Pretty good.
Are you, I hesitate to ask,
yeah.
reading anything new?
No, I'm not. I'm still just in a love affair with Harry Crosby currently. How about you?
I'm not reading anything new either. I have exams in a couple weeks, and I'm almost through reading Jeep Show, which we talked about a couple episodes ago, but nothing new and exciting.
Okay. What did you think of our episode last week? Our video episode?
It was so good. I really liked talking to Ben because he wanted to, obviously he had tons of interesting things to say, but he kind of like, he gets our vibe as like a podcast, and he wanted to talk about the same kind of character stuff that we wanted to talk about. So I did really enjoy that, and I do hope that he'll be back.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about this on air, but Ben was one of the first people of a production to like it goes on about supporting our podcast and talking to us about it. And he was like, "I'll come on your podcast." And we'd done like maybe 6 episodes at that point. I mean, maybe a couple more, but not a lot. So it's really quite nice to have him on for an actual conversation. And I'm sure he'll be back. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Well, you can follow us and rate us 5 stars wherever you get your podcast. Send an episode to a friend. You can visit our website, rosiethereviewer.com, and you can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast.
Thank you for listening and see you next week.
Bye-bye.